So one more note I want to make is just regarding color grading. There's a lot of situations like this that can be a little ambiguous. So for example, are the guys in the sunset light or are they in the sort of bluish ambient light that's on everything? And if you were to logic through the entire exercise, you'd realize that because the sun is setting behind this hill back here, these guys could only really ever be in the ambient shade light or the skylight that seems to be lighting up everything else. So let's take a stab at, rather than making a hue contrast kind of thing like this where there's some affinity with the color of the sky, let's go ahead and just make them the color of the ambient light. So if we look around, we can see there's some white seafoam spray that we might be able to use as a white reference here. There's also some white buildings in the background that we could color pick from as well. Some more white sea spray back here. Let's go ahead and grade this according to something that's much more logical rather than just an artistic take on it, because that might make them feel much more present here. So I'm going to select the grade node that I created for my color balance of my foreground. And as the gain, I'm going to just color pick. I'm going to color pick the best white reference I have, which is probably this patch back here. Now, that's not necessarily going to create a beautiful result right out of the box, but what it is going to do is pick something like that ambient color from the background. Now, right now, it's obviously not feeling right. They feel much too blue. His bandana is feeling too blue even compared to that. And we would maybe expect there to be a little bit of some of these other colors in the background in there. So I think what our strategy here is going to be is to try to make the whites look something like the whites in this environment, and then to maybe make the midtones feel like they're getting some of the value of the sky. And the same with the shadows. We'll try to get the shadows to feel something like the haze that we have in the shot. And that should bring it more into the environment. So I'm control clicking this to get the big slider, and I'm going to desaturate that molt just a little bit so that some more of the original color comes through. And then I'm going to use the value to maybe not multiply everything quite so much, because the sand here is a darker color than these white rocks. So we want the sand color and maybe the skin tones to be roughly the same value. Maybe a little brighter on them. So let's try to get some of the environment color into the midtones just to create some hue affinity between the environment and them. And to do that, we can use the gamma control. So I'm going to pick this sky color, maybe this purplish color from the sky for the gamma. And of course, right out of the box, that's not going to do the trick. The trick was to just get that information into the color picker here. So I'm going to turn up the value just a bit so I'm not doing so much gamma, and I'm going to turn down the saturation. And I think that I might have picked too purplish of a color. We might want more of that reddish color for those colors. So now we're pushing just a tiny, tiny bit of that environment color into the mid-tone values. And we're trying to push around mostly the highlights with the bluish color. Maybe a little bit less saturated on that gamma adjustment. Now let's double check our black levels to see if we're in the same zone, and you'll see right now our blacks aren't really feeling very similar to anything in the environment. So let's push a little bit more of those environment colors into our blacks. We'll pick this area back here to get the hue from that. And I'm going to try to make these two blacks feel the same. The blackest blacks of the foreground to feel a little bit less lifted than this, but the same hue as the background. So I might have to go a little more saturated on those foreground blacks. But not as lifted because there's a lot more haze between us and the foreground. So I'm going to go back to 1:1 viewer gain here. There we go. And I'm going to just tap down the value here by tiny increments until it feels a little bit more right. So there's maybe not too much haze in the foreground, but a little bit of haze. So I'm tapping up again here, just tiny amounts. There we go. And at this point, we've adjusted the foreground color so much, we're going to have to reevaluate the grain that we did to the background. You can see that my grain on the background now, I've essentially darkened the grain on the foreground, which is going to minimize its strength. So rather than picking my grain from my original plate, I'm going to actually pick it from my color-corrected plate for my F-ray grain. Go in here. And I'll reanalyze the grain from picking it from the color graded background. I'll do that for both here. And I should probably resample the grain response as well because the lift gamma and gain of the foreground have changed substantially since my previous adjustments of the grain node. And you'll see that that puts the grain right out of the box. F-ray grain typically does a pretty good job with the automatic grain sensitivity. If you want it to be very, very methodical, you could go in channel by channel, looking at the red, the green, and the blue channels and tuning them channel by channel. But this is close enough for my taste for a quickie like this, so I'm just going to leave it there. So that might be one way to bring it into a color balance that's a little bit more, I guess you'd say, empirically lifted from the environment by analyzing the color of the whites in the environment, the darks in the environment, and the midtones in the environment. And there's a bit of artistic license thrown in here, but this would probably be a more technically correct with an artistic interpretation, meaning that the whites in this foreground are definitely brighter, as if they've got a little bit more light on them, like somebody put a little bit of studio lighting on them. And obviously there's light hitting them from this way, stage lighting, that isn't in the environment, but could be justified by some off-screen light if this was a cinematography type of scenario. Okay, so you've got a couple choices there in terms of what you can do. I just want to see that the color grade has some logic behind it, that you have some interpretation that you've imbued onto the color grading of the foreground, some kind of interpretive logic that you've applied rather than just a willy-nilly random grade on the foreground. All right, can't wait to see what you come up with.